start with this is what are the biggest struggles for those who are trying to help survivors of
I
trauma?
think often those that are trying to help don't understand what they're seeing. They may be with their loved one and life is going on as usual. And then all of a sudden, kind of chaos erupts. That can often happen when their loved one is having flashbacks, for example, or conversely, they may really withdraw and go into a numb zone and they're trying to figure out what happened to the person I know. So there can be some pretty drastic personality
Mm,
changes if someone is re-experiencing some of their trauma. It can be difficult.
yeah. And so maybe it would be helpful to start with for our listeners, how do you classify trauma? Because I think all of us in some way can identify with a traumatic event that's happened in our lives, but
Mhm.
is there a separation between the two, or is everyone walking around with trauma?
I don't think everyone is walking around with trauma,
Okay.
fortunately,
Okay.
but I think a lot of us do have some significant areas of trauma in our life, but how that's going to impact someone depends on both the severity of the trauma, how chronic it is or not, whether it was ongoing over years or whether there was one incident and the age at which the trauma happened. So, for example, if there is, say, someone in combat who has had a relatively trauma free existence up to that point in time, and then experience trauma while they're overseas or in combat, that's going to be a very different scenario than someone who was abused every day for 18 years of their life starting at age 1 before. And the treatment approaches in terms of the counseling end of things are really quite different when it comes to both of those scenarios. And then you have everything in between.
So let's just walk through those two scenarios because I think for our listeners, those are probably the more common things that we hear of, especially our listeners within the military. We do a lot with
Right.
caregivers. We do caregiver conferences with the USO, and many of them are dealing with invisible or visible wounds. And often it's related to something that's happened downrange. So maybe start there. But I also want to cover the other topic, which is the childhood and whether abuse happened, abuse at a very young age. You talk about there's different ways to address that from a therapeutic standpoint. Maybe we could walk through both those if that's okay.
Sure. Let's talk first about someone who has had a relatively trauma free existence, maybe no child abuse, any significance, and then they experience some kind of trauma as an adult. So whether that's a military vet in combat that experiences something traumatic, or whether that's, say, a woman being raped as an adult who hasn't had really a trauma history before that. But one of the big differences is that as an adult, we already have our personalities formed. If we haven't had a lot of trauma, then we have a pretty solid foundation in terms of identity, who we are, our sense of self, how we see the world, and so on. And traumatic events, when it comes to someone who are relatively healthy to begin
Mm.
with, it still be traumatic. Someone can still have flashbacks, it can still impact them, but if they have that solid foundation, chances are that if they get the proper help, they can be healed relatively quick, relatively easily. Nothing's easy about that.
Right.
But compare that to someone who has experienced, especially abuse or any kind of trauma, really, when they're really young, before they have the capacity to understand what's happening to them while they're identity is still being formed. Look at children and how spontaneous, how innocent they are. And if someone sexually abuses them or physically abuses them or even emotionally is abusing them continually, then that impacts the very foundation of their sense of self and how they see the world and how they see relationships. And then if you actually pair that person with someone who goes into the military and goes into a combat situation, then you have a really potentially very negative situation. In fact, which has shown that veterans are more likely to experience PTSD if they also have a history of child abuse.
Okay. Okay.